Let's now learn how to chain promises in order to also render the neighboring country of the initial country that we give to the function. And actually, we already have a small chain of promises because of this JSON function. And so here, these two dens called in sequence are basically already a small chain. But anyway, in this lecture, we will now take chaining to a new level and actually chain together two sequential AJAX calls. So just like before, we first get data about the country, and so that's the part that we already have here. But then we also want to get the data about the neighboring country. And so again, the second AJAX call depends on the data from the first call, and so they need to be done in sequence. So let's simply modify what we already have here. And so the second AJAX call basically needs to happen here in this den handler. So as soon as we get the data, then we need to get the neighbor country and do the AJAX call for that one as well. So let's get the neighbor. And we already know that it is at data 0 at borders, and then also the first one. And just like before, let's say if there is no neighbor, then return immediately. And actually this is not going to work, but never mind about this for now. So we will talk about error handling actually in the next video. Now here there is some kind of problem. We're missing the closing parenthesis here. All right. But now there is no error. And so let's do the second AJAX call. And let me just get the URL from up here. So that's this one. Okay. And so we use again fetch and then the URL. So let's call it country 2 and here country 1. All right. Now for now, this is not going to do anything because what we need to do now is to actually return this new promise. Because then when we do that, we will be able to chain a new den method on the result of this den method. All right. So that's a bit similar to what we did here with the JSON method, which remember also returned a promise. And so we return all of that promise here, and then we can chain a new den method onto that as well. Now in the last lecture, I actually oversimplified how things really work. So actually, the den method always returns a promise, no matter if we actually return anything or not. But if we do return a value, then that value will become the fulfillment value of the returned promise. So let me actually show that to you. So instead of returning this for now, let me just return 23. And so then when I chain a new den method here, let's say data, and then let's alert that data. Let's see. And then indeed we get 23. And so again, that happens because whatever we return from this promise here will become the fulfilled value of the promise. Okay? So again, this here returns a promise, and so we can handle it using the den method. And the fulfilled value, so the success value basically of the promise, will be the value that we return from this den method, right? And so that is this 23 here. And so therefore, in the next den method, then the data here will be 23. And of course, this here must be 23, otherwise we cannot see that in effect. But yeah, so it is 23 because this value is 23. So again, this data that we receive here as an input to this function is the fulfilled value of the promise that we're handling. And so again, that's this value 23 that we are returning from this den method here. Okay, But anyway, of course, the same is true for promises. And so by doing this, so by returning this promise here, then the fulfilled value of the next then method will be the fulfilled value of this previous promise. So of this one. Okay, so I know that sounds confusing, but what you need to understand is that basically this then method here returns a new promise, and here we can then one more time handle the success value of that promise. So one more time, I'm calling this one now a response, because here we are dealing with the fulfilled value of a fetch promise. And so that is a response. And so therefore I like to call it like that. And so here, one more time, we need to call the JSON method. And that is pretty annoying, but that's just how we have to do it. And so here again, the fulfilled value of the promise will become that body. So the data that is stored in the body. And then we can again handle that. So data like this, and then render country with data. And then here again, we pass in that CSS class for the neighbor. Okay, and that should already be it. And indeed, here we go. And if we try something else, let's say Germany, let's see what country we get. And it's Austria. Okay, but anyway, let's just put it back to this one here. And yeah, that's actually it already. So as you can see, promises really allow us to handle these complex asynchronous operations with as many steps as we want. So right now we have 4 steps here even, but of course we could extend this as much as we want. So even if we wanted the neighbor of the neighbor of the neighbor, like 10 countries, we could easily do this by chaining all these promises one after another, and all without the callback hell. So here, instead of the callback hell, we have what we call a flat chain of promises. And this one is, again, very easy to understand and to read. So as a conclusion to this video and the previous one, promises really are an incredibly powerful and elegant solution to handle asynchronous code. Now, just to finish, I want to show you a pretty common mistake that many beginners make, which is to basically chain this then method directly onto a new nested promise. So, as we know, this one immediately returns a promise, and so many beginners basically do this instead. Let me show it to you here. So instead of returning the new promise, they then chain the then method right here. So right inside of this then method. Now this actually does still work, but then we are in fact back to callback hell. Because now indeed we have one callback function here defined inside of another one. So inside of this enclosing callback function. Okay? And so of course, that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. And so don't do this. So always return the promise and then handle it outside by simply continuing the chain like this. All right, but I hope that this was already pretty obvious anyway from all the explanations that I gave you throughout this lecture and the previous one. But anyway, let's now move on and actually handle errors, because that is also a pretty common scenario when we work with promises, and especially with AJAX calls.